I went to the International Congress of Mathematicians in 1978. At the time, I was a secretary of the London Mathematical Society, so I was going in semi-official capacity. And these Hungarians and other certain lucky English people, etc., in particular John Conway, had this new puzzle, toy, and Conway had worked out how to solve it. It was rather funny because I had dinner one night with John Conway and Roger Penrose, two of the brightest mathematicians in the world, and they worked out how to do it. Penrose did not believe that anybody could learn to do it without consulting a pocket full of notes, and his coat pocket was full of envelopes with moves, diagrams written on it, and he was amazed to discover that Conway could do it by memory. And Conway could do it. It only took him about 3.5 minutes. And everybody thought this was mind-boggling. But Conway gave me some suggestions about certain bits, ways you could study part of the structure of the cube. And when I managed to get a cube from one of the Hungarians, it was said that the Hungarian mathematicians had discovered that there wasn't any customs requirement about Rubik cubes, and they could bring them out, and they were worth more than hard currency. And they couldn't get hard currency to go to abroad, and they could take Rubik cubes abroad and trade them for books and even lodging, etc. And I got interested in this. After about 2 weeks, I worked out a method of solving it. And I then made inquiries about getting more of these because they weren't available in England. I wrote we didn't really know who was making them, but I wrote to the Hungarian embassy commercial attaché saying, was it possible to import these? And then I also asked, at that time, my Polytechnic in London had the National College of Polymer and Rubber Technology, and we had injection molding machines. And so I made inquiries about having molds made up and what it would cost to produce these. Nobody knew anything about the origin of them or if there was any patent protection on them. And it would have cost, I don't know, 10,000, 20,000 pounds to set up and start producing them, and I didn't really quite feel like doing that. But then I got a phone call from a Hungarian importer who happened to be a cousin of one of the manufacturers, and he said he had brought in a quantity of cubes, and would I like some? And he had my name from the commercial attaché. And I said, yes, so let's start with 60, because my department had all gotten hooked on these things, and I knew it would be easy to sell that many. So I said, yeah, I'll take 60. And then I walked around my department and asked, I said, I've got a supply of Rubik cubes. We didn't know what they were called. They weren't called Rubik cubes then. They were still magic cubes. And they were all spoken for in 5 minutes. So I went back and rang the guy up and said, well, instead of 60, maybe I should have 100. And they came, and about 3 days later, I had to order another 100. And then 3 days after that, I ordered 200. And within about 6 weeks, within 2 months, maybe 3 months, we had sold all the cubes this guy had brought in. He thought he had enough for several years, and they had gone. And then I started to learn more about the Hungarian bit. When Rubik first produced these, they made a run of 5,000 of them. I think this was 76, and in the spring of 76, and somebody said in September, we better see about, doing some advertising and selling these cubes. And somebody said, well, how many have we got left? And they rang up the warehouse and they discovered they didn't have any left. They thought they had enough to last through Christmas, and it had already run out in September. And this led them to think, we may be on to a winner here, which they did very, very well. And then I wrote, and I was getting correspondence from people. People knew I was interested in it and so on. And the correspondence was confused by the fact that everybody had their own notation for describing what they were doing. And in, I guess it would have been, I suppose, December of '78, I was trying, and I came up with a notation which I didn't like, and then I thought, it's the notation, this is the notation, and it turns out to be the one that is still in use. It displaced all other notations and is now the standard notation for, even when translated into Hungarian and Chinese and Japanese, it's the basic notation and the ideas are continue. And I wrote a whole booklet on the group theory necessary to understand what the Rubik Cube was doing. And about 3 years later, an American mathematician decided and adapted it to be a book on teaching group theory via the Rubik Cube. And it's, as a puzzler, one likes to hold things in one's hand and manipulate. And this is a aspect of perception and knowledge which you don't get in normal classes in arithmetic or calculus or what have you. The sort of kinesthetic or dynamic versions. And at various times described it as the most powerful teaching tool we had ever had, the first real tool for teaching group theory. So you could hold it in your hand and you could understand some of the abstract maneuvers that went on in group theory, what are called conjugation and commutators, which when you see them done on paper, you don't really quite see what's going on. But when you do them physically, you say, that's putting that there, and then that there, and then that back, and then back. Yeah. And all of a sudden, you have a dynamic feeling for what these maneuvers are. And since groups are basically about movement, but it's a good teaching tool because normally the teaching of groups is divorced from any actual object or any actual movement, and having this, I think, is an incredibly useful teaching tool.
Tell us about your academic career.
A bit checkered, but I went to college at Caltech, and at the end of my third year, I got thrown out for lack of academic ability, and I was also caught picking locks, so it was a bit of... and also I found Caltech, I don't know if you've ever been there, it's actually quite a provincial place. Pasadena is archetypal provincial America, one would have to describe it as. And so I went to work for a year, and then I went to Berkeley. And I found Berkeley much more interesting, as you can imagine. This was 1960, and there was lots going on. And then I got married, and I had a flat just off Telegraph Avenue.
No, you didn't.
No, you may not.
No,
yeah.
because
yes,
you had an apartment off
an
of
apartment, okay.
You were an American.
Yes.
So, yeah, you've been out of the country far too long.
Right. Well, when I got to England, I actually corresponded with, and I am acknowledged as a consultant on a bilingual dictionary, American-British, British-American. And I get frequently accused of being English, but in fact I am 100% American.
Yes.
And although I've been living in London since 1970.
Fair enough. Now, your math background did not start out in recreational topics, but clearly you went over. And was that a gradual transition, or was there something more dramatic?
It was a bit. When I was at Caltech, I had gone there thinking I wanted to be a civil engineer. And then I thought I wanted to be an organic chemist because I loved all those formulae, pictures of organic molecules. But when I went to Berkeley, I found that I didn't like physics lab. And then I met through a housemate, a guy named Rick Studehauer, who had a good friend named John Brillhart, who was one of Lamer's students, and they wrote a program to do polyomino puzzles, which was one of the first that did them. There were one or two others about the same time. And I was reading books on number theory and so on, and I started taking more mathematics courses to do a joint mathematics-physics major, and I took set theory and algebra and number theory, and I thought to myself, why have they been hiding these from us? You know, they should be teaching this in high school. And in my number theory course, which was taught by D.H. Lamer, and
Whoa.
good man, yes, and he gave a problem, and I solved the problem, which is how many ways can you write a number as a sum of consecutive numbers? And it has a very elegant solution. It's the number of odd divisors. I think that's the right thing. Anyway, I won the prize, which was a copy of the textbook, and I still have it. I treasure it. And I did some other things. And by the time I got into graduate school, which I got into simply because Lamer had forgotten to write a recommendation, and the graduate advisor was wondering why they should let me in, and he went down and asked Lamer and said, "Must take him in. He's the best man in the class." And that's something like that. And so I got into graduate school, and by the time I'd finished graduate school, I had written 3 papers, and one had even been published already, maybe the second one. And the first one I'm still very fond of, is on round pegs and square holes versus square pegs and round holes. And I never knew which way the phrase went. And I demonstrated that a round peg fits better in a square hole than a square peg fits in a round hole up through dimension 7. And then it changes.
Really?
And John Kelly, who was had taught a course in set theory I had been in, was intrigued. He said, well, there must be a dimension between 7 and 8 where they're equal, the 2 ratios. And I said, yes, there must be. And I got somebody who knew a lot more about calculation than I did, because you needed values of the gamma function. And it comes out some dimension like 7.56 or something like that. Okay. And I had known enough about n-dimensional geometry to know the volume of an n-dimensional sphere, but I didn't know how to compute the gamma function easily, which is a bit of not too trivial.
Well, in those days, you had books of books of game of
Tables,
functions.
yes, we had, so I would look things up with tables, but it wasn't very accurate. And I got a correspondent wrote in from somebody who had a calculator, programmable calculator, which he had set up to compute number theory functions, and he did it to me for 12 places or something like that. And then I went to teach in the Middle East. Anyway, this friend of friends told me about problems, and I did some fiddling with things, and I rediscovered Chebyshev polynomials, which is the sort of thing that every beginning student in this subject comes up with at some point, as Stirling numbers, Stirling functions, polynomials. When you're first exploring this subject, you keep finding these basic ideas over and over again that have been done many times. But so I did puzzle problems in the Fibonacci Quarterly, American Math Monthly, Mathematics Magazine, etc., and that I could figure out how to do, which, and slowly I began to be more interested in puzzles, and I wrote an article on puzzles from the Greek anthology, which is an obscure collection of poems and aphorisms and riddles in Greek, which includes a set of about 40 simple puzzle problems. Yes. Like, I'm trying to remember if this is in the Greek anthology, but there's an ass and a mule crossing a bridge, and the ass says, "If I had one of your sacks, I would have twice as many as you." And the other says, "And if I had one of your sacks, I would have as many as you." And you work this out. And later, when I looked at this as a puzzle later on, I realized that the original problem is, in a sense, incomplete. And many of these older problems have solutions, but they don't ask the question, is this the only solution? Are there other solutions with integers, etc.? And so you could take almost any one of these problems and make it into a whole bunch of problems, which can sometimes be quite interesting.
Well, let me say that first. I've written an article about the word puzzles in the Greek anthology.
Ah, yes.
So I approached it from the other side for my word puzzle friends.
Yes, yeah.
Secondly, though, I think you answered my next question. At what point did you switch from the mathematics of puzzles to the history of puzzles?
Sort of continuously from that, when I got to England, and I was sort of settled and writing stuff. Whenever I found a problem, and I was reading books by, well, of course, Dewdney and Lloyd, and they sometimes would refer to the history of the puzzles, but usually only very cryptically. But one book I found quite interesting was Tom O'Byrne's Puzzles and Paradoxes. And in that, he refers to the Greek anthology. He refers to Alcuin of York's propositions to sharpen the young. And I extracted this. To find this, you have to go to the theology section of your library, to the Patrologia Latina. And there are two versions of it, one attributed to the Venerable, or now Saint Bede, and the other to Alcuin of York. And I photocopied them, and I looked at them, and the Alcuin thing, which dates from about 800, includes river crossing problems. And these are the earliest known appearances of the standard river crossing problems. The man with the wolf and the goat and the cabbages, the three jealous couples, and the getting an army across a river where you have a boat that will hold two kids but one adult. And so these three classic styles of problems appear in Alcuin, and this leads to the question, where did he get them from?
Yes.
And we haven't the faintest idea.
There was no sense that they were original to him.
No, there's certainly, and he only just gives answers very cryptically, so he doesn't really explain what he's doing. But in two things, in one of the problems he gives, he says there is an Oriental merchant who goes to market with 100 dinars or whatever, and camels cost 5, and horses cost 3, and mules cost 3 for 1, and he gets 100 animals for 100 dinars. How many did he buy? And this is, I think, the first appearance in the West of this 100 fowls problem, which appears in China in the 4th century. And this, when you start discovering, ooh, wait a second, where did that come from? And how did this get from, 4th century China to 9th century Europe? But then you discover things like the court of Charlemagne, which Alcuin was based in, had connections with Cordova, Istanbul, even Baghdad. And indeed, Harun al-Rashid sent a white elephant from Baghdad to Aachen, and it got there and was quite famous. And I wondered at the time whether this was remembered. And when I went to give a talk in Aachen about the problems of Alcuin, I went and got there, put my bag in my room, went out and walked down the street looking for a bookstore. I walked into a bookstore, and there in the entranceway was a pallet full of a little book called Abu al-Abbas, the White Elephant of the Court of Charlemagne, a child's book, which was being sold by the thousands, so they still remembered it. And Alcuin would have seen camels in his trips to Rome. They might even have gotten as far north as Aachen, I don't know. But you realize there was more interaction going on in the Middle Ages than we tend to think of. I mean,
and therefore an exchange of ideas.
An exchange of ideas, and these problems, many of them must have come from the Arabic world. And I've got some books in Persian, which I can't read yet, which were first published in the 11th century, and they're still available in Tehran, where the correspondent kindly got me copies. But I haven't yet been able to decide to master the reading Persian. But Persian is interesting because the language has not changed much.
Your collection that I'm aware of is historical in the sense that for a given problem you trace its heritage.
Right.
But it seems to me that, how can you do that? It seems to me you have to just be a vacuum cleaner and find everything and then arrange it into categories.
Right. That's what I've been doing. And I read stuff at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and the British Library, and University College, etc. London is a great place if you want to do research, because you have all this access to these wonderful collections.
Do you have help, or are you out there by yourself?
I'm pretty much by myself, but I do correspond with people, but it takes effort to do that.
Have you considered starting a society for the history of recreational mathematics?
Yes, why not? Yes, okay, right. Anybody who wants to join, come see me.
I think you might have some takers.
Yeah,
You
right.
should
right.
make
Well,
it.
I'm desperate for assistance in some ways, because I've compiled all my data, this history and historical information in a now antique word processor.
Yes.
I can translate from that into Word,
Yes.
but in the process it loses most of the mathematical symbols, it loses Russian characters, it loses accents. It's generally, you then have to go through the result with a fine-tooth comb and repair it, which takes me a long time. I used to give it out at these gatherings on a CD, but I haven't had time to do it again for 10 years now.
The effort to follow these things back through time, is it your goal? Is there any goal to this? Or is it?
Well, no, but I must say that I am sufficiently conceited to compare this collection that I've been doing, Sources in Recreational Mathematics, with Dixon's History of the Theory of Numbers, which if you read, I don't know, Kenneth May or somebody like that writing about Dixon, said it was the only way, proper way to do the history of a mathematical subject, which was to do it in chronological order, subject and subject order, subject classifications. And I've referred to my Dixon quite regularly.
Did you have any interaction with a person who had influence on Martin Gardner, and that was Jekuthiel Ginsburg?
No, not. I know who you mean, but I had a book dealer in London who knew of my interests, and he had interest in mathematics. But when anything came up that was sort of interest, he would let me know. And he had a set of Scripta Mathematica, which was one of the things Ginsburg was involved with. And I have almost complete set of Scripta Mathematica and other journals of that sort, like Recreational Mathematics Magazine. I have a bound set, and I have most of Eureka, which was the journal that Krajcik ran.
Eureka? I thought that was the undergraduate journal.
Yeah, no, this is going back even further, 1920s.
I see.
And he, in it, I think that's the right name. Yeah, I think that's,
Okay.
and he, that was Krajcik, and in it he organized and ran 2 international conferences on the history of recreational mathematics, whose proceedings are included in this journal as well.
Have you considered sharing with the world what you have? For example, just these things you just mentioned should be translated and issued.
Yes, I would like people to do it, yes. All right, but I can't do it all myself anymore.
No, I know you can't, but have people approached you, or are you just literally waiting for people to approach you?
I'm sort of waiting. I haven't got any. At the moment, I am getting on. I will be 80 in December, and I've got these sort of 10 or 11,000 books on recreational mathematics.
While the cameras are running, I want you to say that you will bequeath those all to me.
No, sorry, good try. I think they ought to stay in England because many of them have English connections, in particular, or European ones. Because, I mean, an obvious place would be to try to give them, say, to Indiana to go along with Slocum's stuff. But,
yes, that would be very nice, yes.
I do slightly feel that they ought to stay in Europe. And unfortunately, the Mathematical Association's library is at the University of Leicester, and Leicester uses a cataloging system which is not compatible with COPAC, which is the Combined Online Public Access Catalog, which you can look up on the internet. So when you do, you can put in a book name, and it will tell you each library in England that has it, and in different editions or whatever. But since Leicester's is incompatible with this, it makes it, I'm nervous about putting the stuff there.
Well, send it to Indiana.
Yeah, maybe.
Send it to Indiana.
Well, it is also it has been a considerable investment, so I would like to see some of it coming back. I'd like to sell it to somebody with a really keen collector, like yourself, perhaps.
Oh, yes. I am keen.
Yeah.
The scholarly efforts of different departments in getting back to the original documents, I understand is a growing phenomenon. Is that my misperception? Because you have closer ties with people who work with incunabula than I do.
Yeah.
Is there a growing number of scholars trying to work in this area?
Yeah, well, yes, certainly. There's several things. When you want to go back, say, to Chinese or Indian or Arabic mathematics, there's a growing collection of people finding manuscripts and transcribing and translating them into English.
Yes.
So that's, I don't read Arabic, I don't read Chinese.
That's the reason you need a society of recreational mathematics.
Yes, right.
So those scholars can all come together.
Right.
That's the reason I was saying that I think there are more of those scholars around today than there was 50 years ago.
Well, things like this meeting, there are more people interested in the history of puzzles and games than there were in say, 50 years ago, I think. But some of the great people who worked on this, Lucas in particular,
Yes.
wrote a 4-volume work on recreational mathematics, in which he does a moderate amount of scholarly background trying to explain where these problems had come from. The other person of that era was Wilhelm Arends, whose
Yes.
Mathematische Unterhaltungen und Spiele is a wonderful source and has a bibliography of getting on to 2,000 items, which is a lot of stuff.
Well, I may have told you in the past that I don't own a copy of Ozanam because they're very expensive and no good translations exist or are sold at least.
No, there are no translations to my knowledge. No. Hutton in about 1850 did an English version of it, and that's went through about 6 printings.
Okay.
So they occasionally turn up.
Think about it. The Oxford series of the history of recreational mathematics, series editor David Singmaster.
Yeah. We tried that. We didn't get very far, but we did produce 7 volumes, some of which are so classic that they're highly sought on the internet and Amazon. The book on sliding block puzzles, the book Rubik's book, the book on jumping peg solitaire puzzles. They're classics, which I'm very proud to have organized and edited these things. We had Coffin's book is on polyhedral dissections. Then he's gone on and done several more.
And Ep Simon had a
Yes, those were sort of problem books,
Yes.
interesting problems. That one, my editor at OUP was a friend of Ep Simon, and he did most of the work in recruiting it and editing it. But at the moment, nobody is knocking at my door demanding my services for editing another series of books.
Well,
But except
those were exceptional books, but they weren't the history of
No.
recreational math.
But I am just finishing a 2-volume book for World Scientific, for Rochelle Kronzek, who
Yes.
you may have met or
I've met her.
heard. And that will it's selected writings on recreational mathematics and its history. And so I'm doing some nice historical bits. And I've, for example, recently worked on the problems of Abbot Albert, which are for a 13th century manuscript, which includes the first jugs problem.
Wow.
You have 8 liters of wine and a jug of 5 and a jug of 3, and you want to divide it in half. Now that, incidentally, is a highly unsolved problem. Can you determine in general whether a problem is doable or not? Now, in the simple case where A equals B plus C and B and C are relatively prime, there is the standard method produces a solution in a well-known, easily determined number of steps. But if you ask other questions where the jugs aren't all of relatively prime, but some of them are, you might have 2 and 4, and certain problems are obviously impossible. If you have, let's say, if you have 8 liters of wine and you only have containers of 2 and 4, you can't ever get 1, because everything has to be divisible by 2. And then there's a very beautiful technique devised in about 1940. The total amount in the jugs is constant. And what you have is 3 amounts, A plus B plus C, where A, B, and C, where A plus B plus C is always a constant. And these can be graphed in triangular graph paper in the same way.
The bouncing billiard ball problems.
And the pouring corresponds to a billiard ball bouncing across. And with that, you can examine things and you discover things where the ball bounces around a central region and you can't ever get into the middle, or goes around and never gets into the corners. So there are lots of problems of different sorts, and some are solvable and some aren't. And
let me try to get us back to being finished, unfortunately.
Yes, yeah.
Now, the G4G is on a strong effort. It's going forward.
Yes.
Krajcik had these conferences back in the 20s.
Yes.
Have there been other efforts that have failed like this?
Well, when Richard Guy bought the Strenz collection, now if you were looking at the Escher exhibition, you will see some book plates for the Strenz, Eugene and Willy Strenz.
Yes.
That is the collection which Guy acquired for Calgary, and that collection has been expanding. Richard organized an opening conference for it, I think in 1985, yes, because I think I went from London to it.
They had a conference there afterwards?
Yeah, they had an opening conference and we all talked about it, and this was what Lee Dembart remarked, that there used to be puzzle columns of various things, and I talked to him, or maybe I said that, and Lee Dembart came back a few weeks later and said they'd like to run a puzzle column in the Los Angeles Times, and would I and Saul Golem like to contribute? So we ran for a year maybe.
You have so many stories that we could talk all day.
Yes,
but I'm going to have to finish. I assume you will continue to be a visitor to G4G.
Oh yes, I love it, actually.